The wind of the American West was changing when the story of the Wild Bunch began. Fences and railroad tracks crossed the land. Towns grew where there had once been only dust and grass. In this restless world, a quiet farm boy would slowly turn into one of the last great outlaws of the frontier. His name at birth was Robert Leroy Parker. He was born in 1866 to a poor Mormon family in Utah. His parents worked hard, but money was always short. From a young age, Robert learned the feeling of empty pockets and tired hands. He did not grow up dreaming of gunfights or robberies. He simply wanted a better life than the one he saw in front of him. As a teenager, Robert left home to find work. On ranches, he rode horses, moved cattle, and slept under open skies. The West looked beautiful, but life was rough. Big cattle companies controlled the land, while railroads and banks grew rich and cowboys stayed poor. Robert watched as rich men sat in offices while ordinary men broke their backs for small pay. One small moment began to change him. One day, he walked into a clothing store after closing time. The owner was not there. Robert needed new clothes, but he did not have enough money. He took a pair of jeans. Before he left, he wrote a note promising to return and pay. It was a simple act, but it crossed the line. He had taken what he wanted, and the world had not stopped turning. That small choice did not make him a famous outlaw overnight, but it planted a seed inside him. He began to see the rules of the world as something flexible, not fixed. If the powerful could bend the law for themselves, why could a poor cowboy not bend it too? Robert moved from job to job across the West. Along the way, he met a man who would shape his future even more. This man was named Mike Cassidy, a cattle thief and outlaw. Mike was bold and unafraid of the law. He stole cattle and laughed about it. He lived fast and free, taking what he wanted from a land already being taken by others. Robert watched Mike closely. He saw a different way to live. Mike Cassidy was not a beaten worker. He was dangerous, but he was his own master. Slowly, Robert began to drift closer to that life. Ranch work turned into rustling. Simple jobs turned into small crimes. When the time came for Robert to step fully into this new world, he chose a new name. He took Butch from his time working as a butcher. He took Cassidy from the outlaw he admired. The poor farm boy Robert Leroy Parker faded into the past. The name Butch Cassidy was born as Butch Cassidy. He did not start with huge train robberies or famous holdups. At first there were small jobs, small risks, and long nights planning the next move. He learned how to read people and how to keep control when others were ready to panic. He preferred clever plans over wild violence. Even in crime, he tried to follow one simple idea. It was better to scare a man than to kill him. While Butch was slowly building this new life, the West around him kept changing. Railroads pushed deeper into the frontier. Telegraph lines carried news and warnings faster than any horse. Banks and companies grew stronger, and local sheriffs now had more help than ever. The free frontier that had once belonged to drifters and dreamers was almost gone. This tension shaped Butch Cassidy. He was born in the last days of the open West, but he lived in the age of growing order and control. To many people, he was a criminal. To some poor ranchers and cowboys, he became a kind of dark hero, a man who took money from the big systems they believed were already robbing them. Butch did not yet have his famous partner. He had not yet formed the gang that would be called the Wild Bunch. At this stage, he was still learning, still testing how far he could go, still searching for men he could trust. He did not know it yet, but his path would soon cross with another restless soul, a young man who had his own story of bad luck and stubborn pride. The world would one day know that man as the Sundance Kid. But for now, part one of this story closes. On a single picture, a young Butch Cassidy, riding across a wide, changing land, caught between the rules of the old world and the chances of the new, ready to become the leader of the last great outlaws of the West, Harry Alonzo Langabod did not look like a legend when his story began. He was not born in a gunfight or in the middle of some wild Western drama. He was born in Pennsylvania in 1867, far from the dusty towns and open plains of the West. As a boy, Harry heard stories of cowboys, open land, and big chances waiting beyond the horizon. The East felt crowded and limited. The West sounded big and free. So, as a teenager, he did what many young men of his time dreamed of doing. He went west to look for work, adventure, and a better life. Harry found jobs on ranches and farms, just like many boys his age. He learned to ride hard and fast. He learned to rope and handle cattle. He learned how to sleep under the stars and read the sky for weather. The West was tough, but it made him strong. It also showed him how easily a man could fall behind. Work was never steady. Money came and went too quickly. Sometimes he was hungry. Sometimes he was tired and alone. Like many drifting cowboys, Harry lived one payday at a time. There were no guarantees, no safety, just long days and long rides. Then came the mistake that would change everything. In the little town of Sundance, Wyoming, Harry made a choice that would mark him for life. He tried to steal a horse, a saddle, and a gun. It was not a grand or clever crime. It was simple, risky, and desperate. He was caught, arrested, and sent to jail. Inside those cold walls, Harry had time to think. He thought about the hard work that never seemed to pay off. He thought about how quickly people turned on him. He thought about his dream of a better life and how far away it now seemed. The town of Sundance did not forget his crime. The law did not forget either. The story of the young horse thief spread. Soon, he was no longer just Harry Longaball. He was the kid from Sundance. That label followed him out of jail. Over time, it changed and hardened into a name known. Across the West, the Sundance Kid. The nickname fit him. He was young, fast, and sharp. He could ride well and shoot straight, was quick with his hands and calm under pressure. In a land where many men tried to act tough, Sundance did not have to pretend. He was the kind of man who could stand in the middle of danger and keep his head clear. After his time in jail, the world looked different to him. He knew now that once the law had its eyes on you, it almost never looked away. He had tasted the inside of a cell. He did not want to return, but he also did not believe the world was fair. The line between right and wrong was no longer bright and clean in his mind as the years passed. Harry drifted through the same rough Western world that Butch Cassidy moved through. They did not meet right away. The frontier was wide, and each man had his own path, but both were being shaped by the same forces. Both men knew what it meant to be poor. Both had worked hard for little reward. Both had seen how railroads, banks, and big companies grew rich while the average cowboy struggled. Both had trusted the system at first, and then lost that trust. While Butch was slowly becoming the smart, calm planner of robberies, Sundance was turning into the quiet, steady gunman people called when things might get dangerous. He was not wild and loud like some outlaws. He did not brag or shout his name in saloons. Instead, he watched, listened, and learned. He became the kind of man who was careful with his words, but deadly with his aim. In time, the paths of these two men began to move closer. Outlaws, rustlers, and drifting cowboys often moved in the same circles. They stayed at the same ranches. They drank in the same towns. They heard the same rumors, somewhere out there on the frontier. Butch Cassidy heard about a cool, capable young man known as the Sundance Kid, and somewhere else, Sundance heard about a thoughtful outlaw named Butch, a man who planned jobs carefully and tried to avoid killing when he could. History does not give us every detail of their first meeting. We do not know the exact words they spoke. We do not know if they shook hands in a busy room or met quietly on a trail, or were introduced by another rider over a campfire. But we do know this. When they met, each man saw something important. In the other dot, Butch saw a partner he could trust in dangerous moments. A man who would not lose his nerve when bullets started to fly. Sundance saw a leader who used his brain as much as his gun. A man who tried to control chaos instead of feeding it. Their skills were different, but they fit together like pieces of a puzzle. One thought ahead, the other reacted fast. One preferred plans, the other was ready when plans broke. Together, they were stronger than either had ever been alone. Together, they would gather other men around them, hard riders with hard lives. Together, they would form a gang that newspapers would one day call the Wild Bunch. As part 2 of this story ends, we can see the shape of what is coming. The boy from the Utah farm has become Butch Cassidy. The kid from the Wyoming jail has become the Sundance Kid. The American West is closing in. But these two men are just beginning their rise. Soon, they will ride into history side by side, leading a group of outlaws who will become known as the last great bandits of the Wild West. The West was big, but the world of outlaws was small. News traveled fast along dusty trails and through smoky saloons. By the time Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid began riding together, whispers of their names were already moving across the frontier. They were not yet the leaders of a famous gang. At first, they were just two men with shared frustrations and shared skill. Butch was the thinker. Sundance was the gun. Together, they were a natural center of gravity. Other restless men began to drift toward them. These men were not heroes. They were not saints. They were rough riders with rough pasts. Some had been cowboys. Some had been rustlers. Some had already killed. One of the first was Harvey Kid. Curry Loken. He was shorter than some, but fierce and quick-tempered. If Butch preferred to avoid killing, Kid Curry seemed to carry his anger like a shadow. He could smile one minute and explode the next. Then there was Ben Kilpatrick, a tall Texan with a hard face and a strong body. People began to call him the Tall Texan. He was not subtle, but he was loyal and willing to ride into danger. Another was Will Carver, nicknamed News Carver because his name kept showing up in the newspapers whenever trouble happened. Men like these did not join a gang in the way movies show it. There was no neat sign-up sheet, no uniforms. They arrived, rode together for some time, and sometimes drifted away. The group changed shapes, but the Corbuch and Sundance Dash remained. The gang needed more than guns and horses. They needed a safe place, a home in the wild where the law would not easily follow. They found it in a remote place in Wyoming. It was a broken land of high red cliffs, sharp rocks, and narrow passes. A place where only those who knew the trails could move. Quickly, the place was called Hole-in-the-wall. To most people, it was just a name on the map, a dangerous cut in the land. To Butch and his men, it became something else, a secret headquarters, a hidden village for outlaws. Cabins sat tucked near the base of rocky hills. Horses grazed in hidden valleys. From the narrow trails above, riders could watch the open ground and see anyone coming long before they arrived. At night, a soft glow came from cabin windows. Inside, the men shared food, jokes, stories, and plans. They were outlaws, but they were also human, laughing, arguing, bragging, and remembering the lives they had left behind. Butch Cassidy often sat at a table with a map spread out in front of him. He studied train routes, bank locations, and escape paths. He listened when others spoke, but in the end, everyone looked to him for the final plan. Sundance, usually quieter, checked guns, saddles, and horses. He was the one men trusted to stay calm when things turned dangerous. He did not talk much about fear or doubt. He simply prepared for what might come. This was how the Wild Bunch truly began. Not with a single robbery, but with many slow choices. Who to trust, where to hide, when to strike. Butch created a kind of simple rule inside the gang. He preferred jobs that went after big targets, like railroads and banks, instead of poor farmers or small-time shopkeepers. He tried to make his men understand. We are not here to hurt ordinary people. Of course, real life was never that. Clean, tension, anger, and fear always lived close by. Some men in the group were not as careful as Butch. Some liked fighting too much. Some drank too hard and talked too freely. Still, compared to many gangs of the time, the Wild Bunch had a strange kind of order. They watched the clock. They studied train schedules. They prepared extra horses along their escape routes. They paid certain ranchers and townsfolk for silence, making friends where they could. Word of this careful, clever group started to spread. People noticed that some robberies felt different. They were fast, organized, almost professional. No wild shooting into crowds, no pointless cruelty when things went smoothly. Local cowboys and ranch hands, who had little love for big banks and railroads, sometimes quietly cheered when they heard the news. They told each other, somebody's finally taking from the big companies. Of course, the law did not see it that way. 2 sheriffs, marshals, and railroad detectives, Butch Cassidy and his growing gang, were a serious problem. Every successful robbery made them bolder and made the law more determined to catch them. Back at Hole in the Wall, the men tried to ignore the growing pressure. They laughed loudly. They gambled, told stories, played cards, and tried to live. As if the world outside their canyon could not touch them, but inside. Even if they did not say it out loud, each man knew the truth. There was no retirement plan for outlaws. The story usually ended in one of 3 ways: a bullet, a rope, or a prison cell. For now, though, the Wild Bunch was rising. They had a leader with a brain. They had a gunman with ice in his veins. They had a hideout almost no posse could reach. They had fresh horses, strong arms, and a shared sense of anger at a system they believed was stacked against them. As part 3 closes, the picture of the gang is clear. A circle of hard men around a rough wooden table, maps spread out, lamps burning, late, planning their first big, bold strikes together. Soon, the quiet work in their hideout will turn into loud headlines. The trains of the American West are about to feel the full force of the Wild Bunch. In the next part of this story, their careful planning will meet roaring steam engines, shouting passengers, and exploding safes as the Wild Bunch begins. The robberies that will make them famous across the West. The quiet planning days at Hole in the Wall were over. The Wild Bunch had their leader, their gunman, their hideout, and their anger at the growing power of banks and railroads. Now they needed something else. They needed money. Real money. Enough to keep riding, keep hiding, and keep living on their own terms. Butch Cassidy knew that small-town robberies would not be enough. Stealing from a tiny store or a small bank brought in little cash and big trouble. If they were going to risk their lives, it had to be for something larger. Something worth the danger. To him, the answer was clear. The trains in the late 1800s. Trains were the metal veins of the West. They carried gold, payrolls, and business money in heavy strong boxes. They moved through lonely stretches of land where there were no big towns, no crowds, and no fast help. To the Wild Bunch, trains looked like moving banks with predictable schedules. You always knew where they would be and when. That made them the perfect target. The planning began slowly, with careful questions and quiet listening. Butch watched train routes. He learned which lines carried the biggest shipments. He learned where the trains slowed down, where the land forced them to climb or curve, where it would be easiest to stop them. He talked to people in saloons, pretending to be just another cowboy, but listening closely when railroad men and workers spoke. At Hole in the Wall, the gang gathered around a table while Butch laid out the plan. They would hit a train in open country, away from towns and heavy law presence. They would bring enough dynamite to open the express car where the safe was kept. Fresh horses would be waiting at key points along their escape route. They would not waste time. They would not start fights they did not need. Butch said again what he always believed. "We take the money," he told them, "not lives." He wanted the gang to move fast and leave fear behind, but not bodies. The others listened, some agreeing, some just nodding because they needed the cash. Sundance checked his guns in silence. He did not argue with Butch's rule, but he also knew that once bullets started flying, rules could break. The night of the first big train job came. The sky was dark, and the land was wide and empty. The men sat on their horses, waiting near the tracks, their faces hard and still. Far off, they heard the low rumble of metal wheels. The sound grew louder, the ground shaking softly beneath their boots. The train's whistle cut through the night like a sharp cry. When the moment was right, the wild bunch rode out. They waved their guns and shouted for the train to stop. The engineer, seeing the figures in the dark and hearing the threat in their voices, pulled the brake. Sparks flashed along the wheels as the heavy car slowed. Steam hissed into the air. For a few seconds, there was a strange silence, as if the world was holding its breath. Then the outlaws moved. They split into groups, just like Butch had planned. Some covered the passengers and crew, telling them to stay calm, stay still, and do as they were told. Others headed straight for the express car, where the money was locked away. No speeches, no soft behavior, just fast, direct action. The guard in the express car hesitated, trying to protect the safe. He faced armed men who did not look, afraid he had to make a choice: risk his life for the company's money, or step aside. Most times, men like him chose life. The wild bunch did not want him dead. They wanted what was inside the heavy iron box. The dynamite came next. They packed it around the safe, lit the fuse, and stepped back. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a blast shook the car, sending wood and metal flying. Smoke filled the air. When it cleared, the safe was broken open like a cracked egg. Inside were stacks of bills, coins, and valuable paper, enough to change all their lives for a while. The men worked quickly, grabbing what they could and stuffing it into bags and saddle pouches. No one stopped to count. There would be time for that. Later, right now, every second mattered. On the other cars, passengers watched with wide eyes and shaking hands. They expected wild gunfire or cruel behavior. Instead, most saw masked men who shouted orders but did not shoot unless someone tried to play the hero. Fear was still there, and it was real. But some passengers later admitted that the outlaws seemed strangely controlled, almost business-like dot in a rush of hooves and noise. The wild bunch rode away from the stopped train. They followed the escape route Butch had chosen, changing horses at hidden spots to keep their speed high. Behind them, shocked crew members and frightened travelers stared into the darkness, knowing they had just seen something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Back at Holenthal, the mood was electric. The men laughed, shouted, and dumped out their heavy bags. Money spilled across rough wooden tables. For a moment, the poor cowboys, former ranch hands, and ex-prisoners felt like kings. They had beaten the system, at least for one night. Newspapers soon spread the story. Headlines spoke of a daring train robbery, masked bandits, and a mysterious gang. Rewards were offered. Railroad companies grew angry and afraid. But among ordinary people, especially the poor and those who felt cheated by big companies, whispers carried a different tone. Some said, "These outlaws are wrong, but I can't help feeling they're striking back at the powerful." Others simply felt a thrill that someone had dared to do what most would never dream of doing. As Part 4 ends, the wild bunch have crossed another line. They are no longer just planning outlaws hiding in a canyon. They are active train robbers, known and feared. Their names are starting to spread, and the money in their pockets comes with a growing shadow. With every robbery, they gain more fame and more enemies. Soon, powerful men will decide that this gang must be stopped, no matter the cost. The first big train robbery changed everything for the Wild Bunch. Before, they were known only in whispers, in quiet corners of saloons and lonely ranch houses. After the robbery, they were written in ink. They became headlines in smoky newspaper offices across the West. Printing presses began to roar. Reporters loved the story. Masked riders in the night, a train stopped in lonely country, a safe blown open with dynamite, and the outlaws gone. Before the dust had even settled, the words daring, bold, and fearless appeared again and again. Soon, the newspapers gave the gang a name that would stick: the Wild Bunch. In small towns, people gathered around fresh newspapers, tracing the ink with their fingers. Some shook their heads and said, "These men are a curse." Others quietly smiled and muttered, "Well, the railroads won't like that," as if the Wild Bunch had taken a bit of power back from rich companies far away. But there were other eyes on those stories. Colder eyes, dangerous eyes. Inside the offices of big railroad companies and banks, men in suits slapped the newspapers down on their desks. They read about stolen money, broken safes, and terrified passengers. They did not see legends. They saw a problem that cost them real dollars. They decided to fight back, not with cowboys, not with local sheriffs. They called in professionals. They hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Pinkertons had a simple promise: we never give up. They hunted train robbers, bank thieves, and killers across states and borders. They kept files, photos, and reports. They watched, listened, and followed trails that others missed. Soon, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the Wild Bunch had their faces on wanted posters. The posters were nailed to saloon walls, stuck to post office boards, and pinned up in railroad stations. Black and white photographs stared back at anyone who cared to look. Wanted dead or alive. The rewards were no longer small. For some of the gang, the price on their heads was more money than a cowboy might see in 10 years. This changed everything. Now, every stranger could be a threat. Every person in a bar might be counting how much they could earn if they recognized one of those faces and told the law. Back at Hohenthal, the gang felt the change in the air. They still laughed, drank, and told stories. But beneath the noise, there was a new tension. Talk of rewards, talk of posses and detectives, talk of men who had vanished after the Pinkertons came looking for them. Butch Cassidy tried to keep control. He reminded the men of his rules. They would plan carefully. They would avoid killing whenever possible. They would not stay long in any one place. They would try to hit big targets and then disappear for a while, letting the dust settle. Some of the men listened. Some only half listened. And some, like Kid Curry, were growing more dangerous with every passing year. Still, the money from the first big robbery did not last forever. New clothes, good horses, nights in town, gambling, and hiding all cost money. The Wild Bunch had chosen a road that needed fuel. That fuel was more robbery. So, once again, Butch began to plan. He studied new routes. He learned about another train that carried a valuable shipment, or a bank that held more money than a small town would ever need at once. The gang prepared again. Guns cleaned, horses rested, masks ready, dynamite carefully wrapped out on the frontier. Another lonely stretch of track waited in the dark. Another train's headlamp cut through the night. Another crew and group of passengers had no idea that history was riding toward them on horseback. The second big job felt in some ways like a repeat of the first, but the pressure was heavier now. The men knew there were Pinkerton agents somewhere, out there following patterns, asking questions, and watching every train in town. When the Wild Bunch rode in and stopped this next train, they moved even faster than before. They were sharper, more practiced. They knew how to shout orders, separate the express car, and set the dynamite just right. The explosion rocked the car, and once again, money and valuables poured out of a broken safe. The gang grabbed what they could, hearts pounding, eyes always checking the horizon. One nervous guard reached for his gun. His hand shook as he fumbled at his belt. For a brief second, the air froze. Everyone knew what might happen next. Butch shouted for him to stop. He did not want blood on the ground. He wanted speed and silence. But this time, Kid Curry's temper flashed. His gun was up and ready in an instant. In moments like that, all of Butch's careful rules felt thin and fragile, like paper trying to stop a bullet. Somehow, in that tense moment, the worst was avoided. Or at least, not everyone died that night. But each close call left a mark. Each second where anger or fear took over was a warning. The more they rode, the closer they came to a day when someone would not walk away. After the second big strike, the money flowed again. The Wild Bunch changed their clothes and their names. They moved from place to place, celebrated in hidden corners, and disappeared for weeks at a time. But the law did not rest. The Pinkertons followed every rumor. They spoke to ranchers, hotel owners, bartenders, and railroad men. They carried notebooks, not just guns. They built a picture of the gang, piece by piece, in quiet rooms far from the desert and dust. Men studied maps with red lines drawn across them, showing robberies, sightings, and guest hideouts. A hard truth was becoming clear to anyone who looked closely. The Wild Bunch were clever, but they were still human. They had patterns. They had habits. And patterns can be hunted. As Part 5 ends, the gang stands at a high point and a turning point. They are richer than they have ever been. Their names are famous from small frontier towns to big city offices. But with fame comes focus. The world is watching them now. Every robbery makes them stronger on the outside and weaker on the inside, as pressure, fear, and danger close in like a tightening rope. In the next part of this story, the manhunt will grow even more serious. Members of the Wild Bunch will begin to fall, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid will have to face a painful question. How long can any outlaw outrun the changing world? The Wild Bunch stood on a peak they could not see. They had money, they had a strong hideout. Their names were known across the West. But the same robberies that made them rich also lit a fire under the men who hunted them. In quiet offices, railroad bosses, bank leaders, and government men agreed on one thing. The Wild Bunch had to be stopped. No more excuses. No more waiting. The Pinkerton detectives took the lead. They were not like regular lawmen who rode in big noisy posses and hoped. To get lucky, they were patient. They watched quietly. They followed small clues. They collected every story, every rumor, every small detail. A ranch hand in one town might mention a group of riders with new saddles and fine horses passing through. A barkeeper might remember a man paying for drinks with fresh banknotes right after a robbery miles away. A railroad worker might whisper about a stranger who asked many careful questions about train schedules. All of these little pieces went into Pinkerton reports. From these, a dark picture grew. Butch Cassidy and his gang were not wild fools. They were organized, calm, and dangerously smart. Back at Hole in the Wall and other secret places like Brown's Park and Robber's Roost, the Wild Bunch tried to live as they always had. They played cards, they told jokes, they argued and laughed and bragged about past jobs. But something had changed. The men now checked over their shoulders more often. A sudden sound outside the cabin made hands reach for guns. When a stranger came too close, their eyes narrowed and their bodies tensed. The pressure of being wanted men was sinking into their bones. One of the most dangerous changes came from inside the gang itself. Some men, like Butch, still tried to follow a rough rule. Take the money, avoid killing if possible. But others were slipping further into violence. No one showed this more than Kid Curry. Kid Curry was fierce and quick-tempered. He hated the law with a deep, burning anger. Whenever a lawman got close, whenever a friend of his was arrested or shot, his rage grew. Where Butch wanted control, Kid Curry wanted revenge. In gunfights with posses and marshals, Kid Curry did not hesitate. He shot fast and he shot hard. More and more, whispers spread that wherever Kid Curry rode, lawmen died. These killings made the gang even more feared. But they also made the law more determined, more ruthless, more desperate to crush the Wild Bunch completely. The gang began to split up more often. Sometimes this was part of their strategy. Smaller groups drew less attention. But sometimes it was because of tension, fear, and simple weariness. One man might decide to lie low on a distant ranch. Another might go south for a while. Others drifted out of the gang entirely. Some members were caught. A careless word in the wrong saloon, a letter intercepted, a face recognized in the street. It did not take much. Once captured, men faced hard choices. Hang and die, rot in prison, or talk. Some kept quiet and met their fate. Others gave names, hoping to save themselves, in dusty jails and echoing courtrooms. The Wild Bunch's circles slowly grew smaller. Newspapers that once told stories of daring bandits now printed stories of dead outlaws, captured riders, and widows crying over fallen marshals and sheriffs. Public opinion began to turn. Some people still secretly admired Butch and his men for striking against big companies. But more and more, ordinary folk were tired of hearing about blood on their doorsteps. Butch Cassidy could feel the shift like a cold wind. He was not stupid. He read newspapers when he could. He listened closely to what people said. He understood that the Old West was disappearing quickly. Barbed wire fenced at the open range. Railroads and telegraphs connected towns like never before. The law could move faster, communicate better, and coordinate hunts across many miles. For a man like Butch, who loved planning, the map of his life now looked worse every day. There were fewer safe trails, fewer friendly shelters, fewer blind spots in the system he had outplayed for years. Sometimes, at night, in a quiet cabin or under the stars, he must have wondered if there was any way out. Could he leave crime behind? Could he disappear somewhere and live under a different name? These questions were heavy but real. Sundance, too, felt the squeeze. He was loyal to Butch, and together they were still strong. But he could not ignore the fact that their gang was shrinking. Friends were gone, some deads, some locked away, some vanished into hiding. The Wild Bunch was still alive, but it was no longer the same loud, confident group that had started out at hole-in-the-wall. The Pinkertons were closer now. They knew faces, they knew habits, they knew likely hideouts. Whenever Butch and Sundance planned a new job, they had to ask themselves not just, can we pull this off, but also, can we escape the web that is closing around us? The risks grew heavier with each day. Small mistakes that once meant little now meant death or prison. Even simple things, a letter sent, a friend visited, a trip into town, could bring danger. In this tightening world, an idea began to grow in the minds of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Maybe the only way to survive was to leave the American West entirely, as Part 6 closes. The story has reached a dark turning point. The Wild Bunch has tasted glory and wealth, but now they are tasting the price of fame, tired nerves, splintering trust, and the steady march of law and progress against them. The gang is no longer rising. It is slowly breaking. Soon, Butch and Sundance will face a choice that will change their lives forever. Stay and fight in a land that is closing in on them, or ride beyond the border in search of a new beginning in a strange country far from. Home. As the walls of the American West began to close in, one quiet figure stepped into the story of the Wild Bunch and changed the way Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid looked at their future. Her name was Etta Please. Her early life is still a mystery. Some say she was a school teacher. Some say she worked in dance halls or fine houses. No one knows for sure, but everyone agrees on one thing. She was smart, calm, and stronger than she looked. Etta met Harry Longabaugh, the man the world knew as the Sundance Kid, and their lives became tied together in a way that surprised many. Sundance was not known for big speeches or loud feelings. He was quiet, steady, and dangerous when he had to be. But around Etta, something in him seemed softer. He smiled more. He let his guard down, if only a little. She did not seem afraid of his past. She knew who he was. She knew what he had done. Still, she cared for him and chose to stay by his side. In cabins, boarding houses, and hideouts, Etta Place shared the hidden, human side of the outlaw life. She cooked meals, tidied rooms, and listened to the men talk late into the night. She saw their jokes, their fears, their memories of families left behind. The Wild Bunch were used to danger and risk, but Etta reminded them of something else. Home. Not a safe home, not a peaceful one, but a small circle of warmth in the middle of a cold and changing world. Butch Cassidy liked Etta. He respected the way she handled herself, never panicking, never causing trouble. She was not just an outlaw's girl standing in the background. She watched with clear eyes and understood that this wild life could not last forever. Sometimes, when the mood was calm, Etta spoke honestly to Sundance. She would sit close to him and talk quietly about the future. "Do you want to keep running like this forever?" she might ask. "Do you always want to sleep with one ear listening for horses and gunshots?" Sundance did not always know how to answer. He was good at handling a gun, good at riding, good at staying alive in danger. But when it came to thinking years ahead, his mind often stopped at the next job, the next town, the next hiding place. But Etta's question stayed with him. Butch also felt the pull of a different kind of life. He had always been a planner. He liked order, even inside the chaos of crime. He could imagine owning land, raising animals, running a real business instead of robbing one. The problem was simple and cruel. In the United States, the law would never leave them alone. Their names and faces were too well known. Pinkerton detectives had files on them. Their wanted posters were nailed to too many walls. If they wanted a new life, it would have to be somewhere far away where few people knew their names. And the long arm of American law reached only weakly, if at all. Slowly, a new idea began to form around campfires and in quiet rooms. South America. There were stories of open land in Argentina, of places where foreigners could buy ranches and start over. Two men who had watched the American frontier close up under barbed wire and railroad steel. South America sounded like one last open gate. But this was not an easy choice. Leaving the United States meant leaving everything they knew. The language, the familiar towns, the hidden trails and secret friends. It also meant facing a hard truth. Staying in the West was turning into slow suicide. One night, beyond the reach of city lights, Butch, Sundance, and Etta talked long into the dark. The fire burned low as the stars wheeled overhead. Butch spoke of land in Argentina, of buying a ranch, raising cattle, maybe even living honestly for once. Sundance listened quietly. Etta watched him, wanting him to say yes, wanting him to believe, in a life where every knock on the door was not a sign of trouble. Finally, Sundance nodded. He was tired of always being one bad moment away from a bullet or a rope. He was tired of seeing friends die. He was tired of wondering if every stranger who looked at him recognized the face from a wanted poster. If there was any chance to live like a free man again, he was ready to take it. Etta, too, made a choice. She would not stay behind in the United stayed swinging for news that Sundance had been captured or killed. If he was going to start over, she would go with him. Their decision did not end their outlaw life overnight. They still needed money for the journey and the new beginning. They still had enemies. They still had to move carefully, watching out for detectives and lawmen. But now, their robberies had a new purpose. They were not just grabbing money for wild nights and fast horses. They were building a bridge to another world Ida helped with. The preparations in quiet, practical ways. She packed clothes and important papers. She learned what she could about ships, tickets, and routes. She knew that once they left, there might be no coming back. When the time finally came, Butch, Sundance, and Etta slipped away from the land that had made them and nearly destroyed them. They left behind dusty towns, black and white wanted posters, and the echo of gunshots fading into memory. Ahead of them waited a strange new country, a new language, and the hope that they could become something more than the last outlaws of a dying West. As Part 7 closes, the picture is no longer just guns, trains, and robberies. It is a picture of three people carrying fear, guilt, and dreams in their bags as they sail toward South America. They are trying to trade a life of danger for a life of work and quiet. But the past is not easy to escape. And even on new soil, the shadows of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid will not disappear so easily. The ship that carried Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and at a place across the sea might as well have been carrying ghosts. They left the United States quietly, with false names, carefully chosen clothes, and money taken from a past they were trying to escape. On deck, the air smelled of salt and strange winds. Butch stood at the rail, watching the waves rise and fall. He was a man who had spent his life on dry land, chasing trains and riding through dusty canyons. Now he was chasing something else, a second chance. Sundance stayed close to Etta. He did not speak much. He rarely did. But the hard lines on his face softened when he looked at her. Etta tried to be calm, but sometimes she gripped the rail a little too tight. She was leaving behind everything familiar for a man whose best skill was staying alive under fire. They arrived in Argentina, a land of wide plains, tall grass, and long horizons. In some ways, it felt like the old West they had known open. Land, big skies, and room to breathe. But in other ways, it felt very different. People spoke Spanish in the streets. Newspapers had strange names. Customs officers and local officials looked at them with curious eyes. They used new names for their new lives. No one called them Butch Cassidy or the Sundance Kid here. They were just another foreign couple with a relative and a plan to settle and work. With the money they had, they bought land in the countryside. Soon, a small ranch began to take shape. Fences, simple buildings, cattle moving through the grass. For the first time in years, their days followed a calmer rhythm. Morning brought chores instead of gun cleaning. They fixed fences, checked animals, and rode the land not to scout a robbery, but to make sure their property was safe and strong. Neighbors saw them as hard-working ranchers. They were quiet but polite. They paid what they owed. They did not cause trouble. In the evenings, the three of them sat outside and watched the sun sink into the plains. The sky burned with colors, then turned dark and full of stars. Butch talked about breeding better cattle. He talked about building more fences, adding more land, maybe growing rich in a way that no one could arrest him for. Sundance listened. He was not a dreamer in the way Butch was, but even he began to imagine a life where no one chased him, where guns stayed inside, where Etta did not have to jump at every sudden noise. Etta felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. But the past has a way of following men like Butch and Sundance. Sometimes a visitor came from far away, someone who seemed to know too much, or spoke English a little too icily, or asked strange questions. Sometimes newspapers from North America made their way south. Old headlines about the Wild Bunch and new rumors about detectives traveled across borders. Etta read what she could. She knew that as long as Pinkerton agents were alive and working, someone, somewhere, might be trying to trace their steps. Then there was another problem. Money Ranch life was hard, and the land did not always give back quickly. Fences broke, weather could ruin grazing. Animals got sick, the money they had brought from their robberies slowly began to thin. For men who had once blown open safes and ridden away with bags heavy with cash, it was not easy to accept a life where money came in slowly, bit by bit. After months of hard work, Butch tried to stay strong. He wanted this new life to work. He wanted to prove to himself, if no one else, that he was more than just an outlaw. But deep inside, he still had the mind of a planner of big moves. He still thought in terms of risks and rewards. Sundance, too, felt the pull of the old life. For years, danger had been his constant companion. Adrenaline had been like a second heartbeat. Now, the quiet could feel heavy, like a thick blanket, laid over a fire that did not want to go out. Etta could feel it. She saw the way their eyes sharpened when someone mentioned banks or shipments or easy targets. She saw the way their hands still rested near invisible guns when they were tense. She loved Sundance, but she also feared the part of him that came alive in crisis. Trouble grew slowly, like a storm far off on the horizon. There were rumors of rich targets in South America, 2 payroll shipments, mining money, small banks in growing towns, 2 Butch and Sundance. These whispers sounded like the voices of their past calling them back. Maybe, they thought, just one job. Just one robbery to secure the ranch, to protect the life they were trying to build. Then they would stop for good. That was the lie they told themselves. The same lie many outlaws tell. One last job, and then I'm done. Etta felt a cold fear when she realized they were thinking this way. She had seen what one last job meant in the old life. It meant risk. It meant guns. It meant blood. That she spoke to Sundance in private. She told him flatly that she did not want to lose the peaceful life they had begun. She reminded him how hard they had worked to get here, how far they had come to leave behind the sound of bullets and shouts. Sundance listened because he cared for her, but fear and love had to wrestle inside him with habit and hunger for quick security. Meanwhile, far away, in quiet offices where maps hung on walls, the names Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had not been forgotten. Some detectives believed they had died. Others believed they were still out there somewhere, too smart and too lucky to fall easily. A few reports had suggested American bandits, living in South America under other names. Nothing was certain, but doubt itself was enough to keep their files from being closed. So, as Butch and Sundance rode their Argentine land, inspecting cattle and checking fences, they did not know that the story of their past was still alive on paper, still moving in the minds of men paid to think about such things as Part 8 closes. We see the strange balance in their lives. On one side, a quiet ranch, soft evenings, and the fragile hope of an honest future. On the other side, a thinning stash of money, old habits, and tempting chances to fall back into crime. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are standing on a knife edge between 2 worlds, one a peace they are trying to build, and one a danger they know all too well. In the next part of this story, the storm on the horizon will finally break. Their decision to mix the old life with the new will lead them down a path filled with gun smoke, foreign voices, and a final showdown far from the land where their legend began. The peaceful days in Argentina did not last. For a time, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and Etta Place tried to live like ordinary people. They worked the ranch, they dealt with neighbors, they kept their heads down, but the world around them did not stay quiet. There were questions about money, local people, and officials wondered how these foreigners had bought land and cattle so quickly. Rumors began to move like smoke through the air. Some said, they are not simple ranchers. Others whispered, they look like men I have seen in American newspapers. The old shadow of their past was slowly sliding across their new life dotted. The same time, the ranch did not bring in enough money to keep them safe and secure. Bills came, repairs were needed, ranch work was hard, and the land could be cruel. The money they had brought from their robberies was running low. Once again, the old idea rose. Just one more job. It was a dangerous thought, but to men like Butch and Sundance, it was also familiar and strangely comforting. Planning a robbery was something they knew how to do. They did not know how to make the world stop chasing them. In time, Etta went back north, most likely to the United States. Some say she left because she was tired of running. Some say Butch and Sundance sent her away to keep her safe from whatever was coming next. Whatever the reason, her part in the story grows quiet. The two men were alone again. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid left Argentina and moved on, drifting toward Bolivia. Bolivia was a land of mountains, mines, and remote towns. It was far from the American West, but in some ways, it was still a frontier. There were mining companies, payroll shipments, and banks that handled money in lonely, dusty streets. To Butch and Sundance, this place looked like a strange mirror of the world they had left. Different language, different land, but the same kind of targets. They tried once more to mix two lives, work and crime, honesty and robbery. In mining areas, they heard about payrolls being carried by mule or wagon, moving through harsh country with only a few guards. Soon, money was taken. A payroll was robbed. Witnesses spoke of two foreign bandits, skilled and calm under pressure. The names Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid were not used in the reports, but two men who knew how these two worked. The pattern felt familiar. The legend says that in 1908, somewhere near the town of San Vicente in Bolivia, a small group of men carried a mining company payroll. Two bandits attacked, took the money, and vanished toward the town. The alarm was raised. Soldiers and local authorities began to search. Soon, they tracked the suspects to a simple house or boarding place near San Vicente. Inside that house, two foreign men were staying. They matched the stories people told. As the light faded and night came on, the place was surrounded. Voices shouted in Spanish, calling for the men to surrender. Inside, Butch and Sundance would have known exactly what this meant. They had been in tight spots before. They had broken through posses, outrun sheriffs, and vanished into canyons. But here, in a foreign land, there were no safe trails they knew by heart, no friendly ranchers waiting with fresh horses, no secret hideout like Hole Dash, In Dash, the Dash Wall. The legend paints a tense picture. The two outlaws look at each other in the dim room, guns in their hands, backs to the wall. They hear boots outside, the scrape of men taking cover, the clink of rifles being raised. Then someone fires. No one knows for sure which side shoots first. Maybe a guard, maybe one of the outlaws. Gunfire explodes in the night. Bullets tear through walls and windows. Shouts echo through the narrow streets. The men in the house fire back. Quick, sharp shots from men who have spent their lives in danger. But there are too many guns outside and only two inside. Some versions of the story say one of the outlaws was hit first, shot and badly wounded. Some say it was Sundance. Some say it was Butch. One version claims that Butch, seeing his friend too hurt to escape, made a terrible choice. He is said to have given Sundance a quick death, rather than let him fall into the hands of the law. Then, the story goes, Butch turned the gun on himself. When the shooting stopped and the soldiers finally went in, they found two dead men in the house. This is the scene that has been told and retold for more than 100 years. A final stand in a small Bolivian town, the last bullets of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But here is where the mystery begins. The bodies were buried, reports were written, Stories spread, yet, in the years that followed, no one could fully prove that those two men were truly Butch and Sundance. Some records were unclear, some bones that were tested years later did not match well with known Cassidy family remains at the same time. News stories began to float around. A man in the American West claimed that Butch had returned under another name and lived quietly for years. Others swore they had met a man who looked and talked like Sundance long after the Bolivian shootout. Most historians lean toward the idea that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid did die in that house in Bolivia in 1908. The details may be blurry, but the timing and the reports line up. Still, the lack of final, absolute proof keeps a small door open in people's minds. Maybe they died there, surrounded by a foreign army in a foreign land, or maybe they slipped away one last time, the same way they had always slipped through the fingers of the law in the pages of history. Either way, the story feels like the end of something bigger than two men. It feels like the end of the old idea of the outlaw, the open range, the hidden canyons, the train robberies under wide western skies. As part 9 closes, we are left with a silent house in Bolivia, two still shapes on the floor, and a question that has never fully gone away. Did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid die there that night? Or did the last outlaws of the West manage to escape into legend, leaving the world to wonder forever? In the final part of this story, we will not follow their boots or their guns, but their memory, how their lives became legend, how the wild bunch turned into myth, and what their story still says about power, rebellion, and the changing world we all live in. The story of the wild bunch does not end only with gunfire in Bolivia, or with two bodies lying still on the floor of a small house. After the smoke cleared, after the soldiers left, after the papers were written and the graves were filled, something strange happened. The men themselves were gone, but their story refused to die. In small towns and big cities, people told and retold the tale of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Some spoke of them as brutal criminals. Others spoke of them as daring rebels. The truth lived somewhere in between. Newspapers had once chased them for headlines. Now, books and later movies would turn them into characters who rode across the screen in slow motion. But behind all the stories, there were two real men. A poor farm boy named Robert Leroy Parker, who became Butch Cassidy. A smiling planter who tried to rob with brains instead of blood. And a quiet kid from Pennsylvania and Wyoming, Harry Lungabaugh, who became the Sundance Kid, a calm and deadly gunman who followed his friend to the end of the world. They did not start as legends. They started as boys who wanted more than the world offered them. The West they grew up in was hard and unfair. Big companies and banks grew rich. Railroads cut through land that once belonged to small ranchers and native peoples. A man who worked with his hands could break his back for years and still never get ahead. In this world, Butch and Sundance chose the outlaw road. They did not face the system with words or votes. They faced it with guns, plans, and fast horses. They hurt people. They scared passengers on trains, guards on safes, and townsfolk who heard gunshots in the night. But, as much as they could, they tried to follow their own crooked code. Take from the big powers, avoid killing if possible. Use the gun as a tool, not a way to prove glory. Of course, the world is not so simple. The wild bunch caused real fear and real damage. Men died because of them, sometimes in gunfights, sometimes because the law and the gang pushed each other too far. And yet, even with all the blood and noise, people kept feeling a strange pull toward their story-wide. Maybe because many people, in every time and every place, know what it feels like to think, the game is rigged against me. The rules do not protect people like us. Butch and Sundance took that feeling and turned it into action. Wrong. Action, dangerous action, but action that made them feel powerful in a world that often made them feel small. Their story shows the dark side of that choice. For a while, they were free and rich. They laughed around campfires, ran wild with their friends, and rode through the West like kings. But the cost never stopped growing. Friends were arrested, shot, or hanged. They could never rest, never trust a stranger, never walk into a town without watching every face. Even when they tried to start over on a ranch in South America, their past followed them like a long shadow. They could change their names, change their country, even change their work. But they could not easily change who they were inside or what they had already done. In the end, whether they died in Bolivia or somewhere else, their lives show one hard truth. You can outrun the law for a time. You can outrun your enemies for a while, but you cannot outrun the person you choose to become. The world around them changed too. The open range of the cowboy became fenced land. The old trails were crossed by steel rails. Telegraphs and, later, telephones made it easier for lawmen to share news and hunt far and wide. The Wild West was turning into something else, a more connected, controlled, modern world. In many ways, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were not just the last outlaws of the West. They were symbols of a whole time period dying. After them, train robberies became rarer. Hideouts like Hole in the Wall grew empty. The idea of the lone outlaw riding free across endless lands slowly faded into stories, songs, and films. Today, when people hear their names, they often think of legends, not real men. They see the smile of a charming bandit, the cool eyes of a silent gunman, the soft glow of a sunset over wide plains. But somewhere under that picture, there is a deeper story of a poor boy who didn't want to stay poor, of a quiet kid who didn't want to feel powerless, of a woman at a place who loved a wanted man and tried to build a new life in a new world. Their choices took them far from home, across borders and oceans, into new lands and new dangers. Their story is not a simple story of heroes or villains. It is a human story, full of dreams, pride, fear, and stubbornness. If there is a lesson inside it, maybe it is this: when a world feels unfair, some people will try to break it. Some will become outlaws on horses, others will cheat, lie, or fight in different ways. But in the end, every choice has a cost, and no one escapes that bill forever. As the tale of the Wild Bunch closes, the dust of their horses has long since settled. The trains they robbed are gone. The banks they hit have changed or vanished. The towns they passed through have grown, shrunk, or disappeared. But the story remains. Around campfires, in books, on screens, people still say their names: Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, the Wild Bunch. And somewhere in that quiet pause after the names, people still wonder, were they monsters? Were they folk heroes? Or were they simply men of their time, caught between a dying frontier and a rising modern world, trying to hold on to freedom in the only broken way they knew? Their legend rides on, not as a guide for how to live, but as a reminder of how powerful, dangerous, and unforgettable the human hunger for freedom can be.